All right, guys, we're starting key concept 4.3, which is state consolidation and imperial expansion. So we're basically going to be talking about the different governments that were either maintaining their power or evolving throughout this time period. It's not a very long PowerPoint, but it is a lot of information, so let's buckle down and get going. The first thing we're going to talk about is China. Ming China was founded by Zhu Wanzang. I think I'm saying that right. And he was a warlord who had assisted in the expulsion of the Mongols from China. The Ming Dynasty, which reacted against Mongol rule by returning to Chinese tradition, lasted from approximately 1368 to 1644. And some characteristics of Ming rule were that they revered the position, or the revered position of the scholar gentry was restored. The Confucian-based civil service exam was reinstated and updated. Women, however, continued to be banned from taking this exam. Public officials who were corrupt and or incompetent were actually beaten publicly. Thought control or censorship of documents was sanctioned by the government. Neo-Confucianism, which supported strict obedience to the state, was increased in influence. And women continued to occupy a subordinate position in this strongly patriarchal society. We've talked about Zheng He before. Between 1405 and 1423, the Ming Dynasty was under his leadership, Zheng He, and he engaged in these major expeditions of exploration and trade with his treasure ships. He sailed through the Indian Ocean, the Arabian Sea, and the Persian Gulf, but by the 1430s, the scholar gentry persuaded the Ming leaders that the expeditions were too costly in light of the need to spend the empire's funds on restraining continued Mongol threats, and so they quit. In the late 16th century, Jesuits, such as the scholar Matteo Ricci, were actually allowed to enter China. More interested in the Jesuits' transmission of scientific and technological knowledge than in the actual Christian theology, the reason they were there, the Ming Chinese allowed some Jesuits to remain in China throughout the entire Ming era. But during the last 200 years of the Ming Dynasty, China was ruled by some incompetent rulers, and the maintenance of dams, dikes, irrigation systems was neglected, and nomadic peoples continued to exert pressure along the Great Wall. And in 1644, the Jurchen, or the Manchus, which were nomadic people on China's northern border, conquered the Ming Dynasty. And this was the new Qing Dynasty. The Qing Dynasty was concerned with Russia's rising power to the west and, of course, the Mongols to the north. In the late 17th and early 18th centuries, the Qing military went on campaigns to add land in Central Asia to separate China from Russia, but that's a little bit later in the time period than we're talking about. The Qing military also conducted campaigns in Mongolia to end the threat of any future invasions. And China was one of the great land empires by this point. It added the island of Taiwan in East China to its empire in the late 17th century. The kings also continued some Chinese traditions, like Confucianism. The Chinese men were required to wear a queue, which was basically a long ponytail to distinguish themselves as a Chinese person or a Manchu. Control over large tracts of land led to the growing economic gap between the rural peasants and the rural gentry. In fact, some of the rural gentry started growing their fingernails very, very long to distinguish themselves as somebody who does not work on the land. And they relied primarily on regional trade. They weren't very interested in trading at long distances with other peoples of the world. In general, the king did not force the peoples they conquered to adopt Chinese practices. Instead, they allowed local rulers to keep ruling as long as they obeyed king policies. And they were also tolerant of local faiths and customs. They did limit the movements of pastoral herders, and this significantly reduced the number of people who continued that way of life. And they also allowed the trade routes along the Silk Roads to wither away, preferring ocean trade to camel caravans over land.